Happy BWI Friday, basically. This is the final show of the week, so it's Friday. We got more weekend content coming up, so don't worry. But this is our final live show of the week. Ryan is out because the internet doesn't like him today. We've all been there before. So
he just sent me a picture of the guys that he hired to sit outside of his house, posing as Comcast guys, to take him off the internet. He said his internet should be back roughly around 11 a.m. on Thursday. So hopefully that's the case for him.
Makes perfect sense. He's getting an early start on spring break. We won't be on air next week. So as far as the live show goes, we'll still have updates, still have some videos for you here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. But we're going to be talking recruiting today, obviously. That's the plan. We have a special guest coming up at the second half of the show. But the news this week, more bad news for the Penn State offense for spring football. So let's get into that right away. Penn State's best offensive lineman and only returning starter from the 2025 season, Anthony Donkoh, will miss spring football. So, Fitz, can you give us the latest rundown on what's going on with Donkoh?
Yeah, you were on the edge there for a second. I thought I was reading the wrong rundown. No, Anthony Donkoh going to miss the spring. Going to be a similar situation to what we saw with tight end Andrew Rappleyea. Had some offseason cleanup done, and he's going to be back for the season. Just you're not going to get him in the spring. We talked a little bit last week. There was a mailbag about actually that may have been this week. Everything's just passing at the same rate of speed right now. Asking about offensive installation veteran reps, defensive installation veteran reps. We said there's going to be a lot of guys out. Donkoh, one of those guys that has been, just needs to get right. And he obviously had the injury, I guess, in the 2024 season, and has been banged up a little bit in 2025. So you got to get him healthy. You got to get him on the straight and narrow there. Kind of a situation similar to Tony in a sense that like these guys are their main guys and the guys that they earmarked to bring back and want to bring back, but got to be healthy to do that. So it's going to be a fun little spring for guys like Owen Alasini, Garrett Sexton, Malachi Goodman, guys that will slide in those tackle roles. And hey, they got reps to go around. That's what spring is for.
The situation like this and with Andrew Rappleyea kind of fills me with more questions than it does answers. And all of these are, as you mentioned, just like the losing spring practice, not ideal, but also when it's planned, when it's something that doesn't happen as a freak injury or something like that, or, something that, like we saw with Max Granville last year, it's not the devastating news it could be. And yet at the same time, the timing surprises me. So I'm just going to list a couple of questions I have out loud. Did they do it now because they wanted to get through winter conditioning and they wanted to make sure they got through the grind to get better? As I've talked about, if you aren't actually in the weight room, you're not going to be improving. And so was it done now because the calculus was which would you rather miss? And the physical aspect for a guy like Anthony Donkoh, as you outlined, for 2 years, he's had injuries that he's been playing through. This is a guy who probably hasn't been full go in the offseason to do that work. Now, missing time in the offseason, you're missing different portions of time, right? So you're missing different aspects of the off-season progression cycle in athletic lifting and training. So, but the growth part most likely happens furthest away from the season as possible. So that's when you're adding the muscle and the size and getting back to being a really strong human being after the drain of the season. That happens in January and February. And was it intentionally done so they didn't miss these things? Or is it just kind of like a thing they decided to do now? And so to me, those are the important questions of, is this calculated or a thing that happened? And I don't have that information. Obviously injury information is going to be kind of sparse at best. And some of these decisions, did it come from the staff? Did it come from the player? So all these kind of decision-making process questions as to why you're missing spring football over doing it earlier in the year, if this is something you knew you were working with, all those raise questions that are more about process than outcome for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I don't know that there's ever a right time to do it. You want to get as much as you can. You talked about, building up in the off season. Well, what's that worth when you can't turn around and sort of reap the benefits of it right away? but also you can give yourself the prehab, if you will, the ability to get strong where you need to get strong, and then use the science of it to make yourself more apt to recover quickly and correctly, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you can do that. And then you look at the calendar. Penn State's got spring break coming up. So is that a situation where you've got the opportunity to sort of get some downtime, get some recovery time? It's like, the guys, but the guys get the vasectomy before the March Madness, like that kind of thing makes sense when you're talking about appropriate downtime and appropriate recovery time for him. But he's expected to be good to go for camp in August, and that's the main goal right now. I mean, how many games are you playing? How many games are you playing in the spring to count? 0. So you've got that to work with. Ideally, you'd love to have him out there to mesh with the guys, to get into the new offense. He's played a lot of football though, so I think that's helpful. But also, we can acknowledge that it's not great to have a laundry list of offensive guys that are going to miss all or part of the spring. You've got the list here on the YouTube show. You got Rocco Beck, that's an obvious one, coming off of the December surgery, where he's going to work in the back half of spring practice. And at that, it's going to be a limited scope of what he can do. Gabe Burkle, don't expect to see much of him this spring. Andrew Rapplier, don't expect to see him in the spring. Chase Soul, Brett Eskildson are guys that are, dealing with, like, I want to say, cleanup is the way that we go about it, right? You've got varying levels of, hey, this guy played through the year. Football is a violent game. He played through the year. He was able to get through the year. It's like Drew said at the combine, like, I could play right now if I needed to. Well, I mean, now is the time to get all that stuff taken care of. So you're going to see a lot of that. And I think there's going to be a couple other guys that pop up on this list eventually. But I think that's pretty normal. Love to have them, but pretty normal otherwise.
Yeah. The part of it that is notable, I guess, is that there are 6 of our 11 projected penciled depth chart starters. So the one that's obvious is, as you mentioned, Rocco Becht as the starting quarterback, but then 2 of the top receivers, 2 of the top tight ends, and then your top offensive linemen. That, from a cohesive standpoint and from a chemistry standpoint, I made the case in yesterday's show, and then an article I wrote about the quarterback preview, that you already have that chemistry with the Iowa State players and Rocco Becht. But you don't have that with Andrew Rapplier, and you don't have that chemistry of understanding, body language and communication skills between Anthony Donkoh and the quarterback and whomever is going to be the center. So there are aspects of spring football that you're going to miss out on. But as you mentioned, with veteran players, like, inside zone is inside zone. Gap and duo, the tenets are always the same. It's how you want to coach them. It's the details of the positional nuances. And at least for veterans, that is not what you're going to be. That is not as critical for you at this time of the year, given we've seen you produce on the football field. But it is all the little things, the little adjustments, the micro adjustments that make you go from, good to great in terms of your execution of something. And so it's a trade-off, right? But on the positive side, Fitz, and we talked about this. People in the chat have already said this. Great time if you're Malachi Goodman or any of those young tackles who are going to get more reps this spring, and you're going to get all those things that we just talked about that Anthony Donkoh is missing. If you're going to be missing a player, adding in the depth experience and getting those players more reps, that has to be a thing that happens. Like, that has to be the bonus on the other side of this for some of these players down the perceived depth chart, at least at this point.
Yeah, and we'll fully admit that's a bit of spin, because you've got, ideally you'd love to have your healthiest, best players healthy all the time. It doesn't happen, but ideally you like to have that. But you make the best of what's around, right? The best of the situation, and you've got young tackles. Now you've got a lot more. Kuel, Will Tompkins. You've got guys that can potentially throw in there and see if they can be part of your 2 deep next year, and you sort of filter out that 2 deep. You're not as great on numbers as you were last year in terms of overall. I mean, 24 offensive linemen last year. I think they're down a couple in that group, and then you've got a couple freshmen that are coming in that probably aren't ready. So you've got to work through that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's an opportunity. It's what you make of it. And we talk about the veteran reps. We talk about the ability to go out and take it easy for some guys in the spring, well, the dial turns up for some of those young guys, and I'm excited to see it. I'm always looking to see what's I don't want to say optimistic, but like the guys that have that opportunity have time to do something with it now. So I think that's pretty cool to watch. I'm also curious. You look at that list that you put up earlier, and Beck, Burkle, Ben Bramer's been said he's been banged up as well. Sol, Eskildsen. I'm curious. When they got to Penn State, we talked to a couple of players, and this is not. I'm staying away from the Iowa State Penn State media beef that came out of nowhere last week. That's just like, I guys, whatever, you guys do a great job out there. But when talking to the players, there was clear differences in facilities, quality of facilities, and the ability to, sort of get what they need. And I'm curious if this has something to do with it. You're coming from Iowa State to Penn State, where, you've got great medical opportunities at your reach. And I think that might have something to do with it as well. When we talk about cleanup, when we talk about how this can all come together for those guys to get yourself in ideal shape for September, October, November, when it matters, really.
Yeah. So we'll see how all of that plays out in about 3 weeks here, with Penn State football starting their spring practice at the end of March. And more details on that, by the way, to come from us here at Blue White Illustrated and Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. Friendly reminder for you to like the video and subscribe here to the YouTube channel, because this is the recruiting show. We're going to get into recruiting in just a second. At some point, they are going to get their first recruit commit in the class of 2027. And when that happens, after the long sleep cycle of the breaking news and committed graphics, they're going to go back up, and it's going to be a flood because they need a lot of commits in this class. So be the first to know when that happens by subscribing here to the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel and subscribing, liking this video, helping us out with the algorithm. The almighty algorithm changes every day. It is like a virus in an amoeba that just shifts, and every time you think you got it down, you don't. But I know I'm asking a lot. I know we're at that transition point. The best thing you can do to support us here, by the way, is to subscribe to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. And right now we can help you out with a 50% off sale, because we have some, we're celebrating the acquisition and the introduction of some new national reporters here to the site. And you're actually going to get a long conversation with Alan Triue coming up on the second half of this video. So stay tuned for that. He and Fitz had a great conversation about all those things. So that's coming up, and you can get a fat half off at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com if you want to join us right now. And of course, I want to thank today's show sponsor and tell you a little bit more about Liberty Lumber Products. Here's Justin.
How's it going, Nittany Lion fans? My name is Justin. I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, and this is my wood shop. We are Liberty Lumber Products. Come here, I want to show you a few things. So my company is now officially licensed with Penn State. So I want to show you the products that are now available at our online store. We now have some coasters that are available. These are handmade by our team here at Liberty Lumber Products. We have some very talented carpenters here. And we also have this cooler that's now available. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. Please follow us on our socials and check out what we have coming next. We've got some big things.
Justin and I are on a texting basis. He texted me this morning and said, somebody from the YouTube channel just bought that cooler. So awesome. The link is in description of the video, and you get 10% off with the promo code PSU10. I got too many tabs open. Here it is. Yeah, right here. So promo code PSU fans for 10% off. PSU fans for 10% off at libertylumberproducts.com. Got another video I want to show you, just because I am a huge fan of walnut. Hardwoods in general, but walnut is beautiful. And look at the color of the Penn State logo on these things. The official licensing is like a big deal. There's a lot of people that do a lot of great work with epoxy, that do a lot of great work with, hardwoods. It's the microbrewery of the 2020s, right? But not everyone can do what Justin and his team are doing at Liberty Lumber Products. So this bar top table looks amazing. You got a fan cave? No, you don't. Not until you get one of these things. You can check it out and get 10% off. And as always, when you get a bigger product, 10% means a lot more money than when you're buying something that's small. So Joe, check them out. Appreciate Justin for being a sponsor here on the show.
And we appreciate you. You mentioned somebody from the show bought something, used the code, bought that cooler. Thank you guys. Really, like, heartfelt. Like it's
yes,
absolutely awesome to see some of the connections that are users, readers, whatever, have made with our sponsors, because that's why they come to us. Like, we want to send them business. We want to send them the best of Penn State fans, and we believe that's you guys. And we hope that you guys continue to support those folks, because they've done a wonderful job supporting us, and we are very appreciative of them.
Absolutely. And while we're at it, if you own a business you want to advertise on here, you can let me know. Hit me up on social media. You can also send me an email, and we'll discuss. Fitz, I'm going to leave this segment just kind of open-ended. Penn State football recruiting news. We are now into March. The calendar and the recruiting calendar have both changed. And so I want to let you have the floor. And in this particular section, what's the latest Penn State recruiting news? Normally, I'd be going to Ryan and saying, "Hey, Ryan, you've talked to 37 recruits this week. Which were the 4 most interesting, or whatever?" You're on the intel side, and that's always a little bit murky for me, because I don't want to be like, "Hey, Fitz, what's the thing I'm not supposed to ask you?" So you have the floor. What's going on with Penn State football recruiting this week and this month, as we're heading into the spring practice period at the end of the month?
So before I get into that, I want to look back to what I wrote last Friday. We didn't get to talk about that on the show earlier this week, but I did roughly 3,000 words. It was a horse in terms of words and content and stuff like that on Matt Campbell's ability to recruit in a timely manner. And I think that that's something that Penn State fans have had opinions on in the last couple of months. Penn State without a commitment in the class of 2027. Is it ideal? No. Is it a death knell? No. But you're looking at this class and trying to summarize it in the first 3 months of his tenure, which is not particularly wise to begin with. But when you look back at the historical data that he of his time at Iowa State and what he was able to do, not completely an outlier, not a big early commitment guy. We've talked about this in the past at Blue White Illustrated on the message boards and I guess in articles as well. Is not a high pressure staff early. And what that means is not that they don't want to take commitments early. If somebody high on their list wanted to jump on board, I believe they would be happy to take them, happy to get this class started. But there's a difference between being a high pressure and having a guy that's, got one foot in the door and you're trying to pull him the rest of the way. So I think that plays into it. And I went back to really the class of 2022 because, it's really the first post-COVID class. Remember, we didn't have visits until June 2021, and then it got rolling again. A couple of things here. It rolls with winning. When they did have early success, it was coming off of an 11-win season. Coincidentally, it was a class of 2026 guys that a bunch of those guys ended up at Penn State. Mason Bandauer is one of those guys, the offensive lineman who, if you look at things that don't make a ton of sense, he's an Iowa State legacy, and he chose to go to Penn State over signing. He originally signed with Iowa State. That's an outlier. That is interesting to me, because that is telling you about the relationships that he was able to bond with Campbell, with Ryan Clanton, the offensive line coach, and probably, I don't want to say shouldn't happen like that for a guy from Fort Collins, Colorado, but Penn State's a long way away, and he was able to make that switch pretty quickly. So I think that tells you something in terms of the relationship building, the ability to recruit guys like that. We talked about Cooper Terwilliger. We talked about Case Alexander, guys who have brothers that have played for Matt Campbell. I think all that stuff kind of combines and gives you the blueprint for not necessarily what they're looking for, but what they're eventually going to get. And I think they'll get there. There's a little bit to overcome here. We've talked about the challenges that they're facing. They don't have natural connections in this area. They hired a couple guys that have natural connections in New Jersey. Still got to work on Philly. Still got to work on the DMV. Virginia has been something that they're trying to get into a little bit further. And then New England, I think is fascinating because it's completely plowing new ground for them. Not to evaluate up there, but it's a different game. You've got prep schools, you've got reclassified kids. Pat Fryermuth came in and he was a year older than everybody. You've got a bunch of those guys like that. Peter Bork's like that. And now you're going into sort of a different approach when it comes to these guys have been recruited as high schoolers to high school, and now you're recruiting them to the college level. And there's a lot of schools that are involved there. New England does a wonderful job. The guys up in Connecticut and Massachusetts do a wonderful job showcasing their players and making it accessible to everyone in the country. If you're a Penn State guy, that's not great. But if you're they come up in Alabama's taking guys from there, all over the Georgia's taking guys from New England.
It seems like the New England structure is, if you are a top prospect, they're going to make sure that everyone knows about you. It might not be the densest region, but it does seem to have like the top part of New England with, you mentioned the guys, Owen Alcini's another player in there. Samson Okunlola a couple cycles ago, that if you're a guy in New England, everybody's going to know about you. Is that kind of what you're saying?
They work together, which is a foreign concept, but all the prep schools, if you look at the spring evaluation period, they have a showcase, basically 3 days, 2 or 3 days, where you start at Avon Old Forums at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then you go at 10 o'clock, you're at Cheshire Academy. You are hopping from school to school. So legitimately, these coaches are riding together, going from school to school, looking at all their guys. And I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's, they've got several different schools up there that, it comes in waves. There's never like a top situation, but you've got really good, smart coaches up there that make it work for their players. It sounds so simple. It sounds so crazy to think about how all this stuff is on the field, your rivals and everything like that, but you're doing the best for your kids. And right now, Jeff Moore at Tabor Academy's got 5 of the top 10 guys in New England, in Massachusetts. You got a couple of good quarterbacks. M2 Quarterback Academy up there is you got Peter Bork, Will Woods up there. Keegan Croucher was in there before, and it's really awesome to see them working together. And then from a flip side, from a Penn State perspective, you'd like to hide those guys a little bit more if you had the opportunity to do so. So I think that's a fascinating dynamic when you're talking about recruiting the region. Again, they need to establish themselves in the DMV. They need to get those relationships humming, and I think they're going to be behind because of it. Like, that is one thing that when you're taking a look at past classes, the concentrated numbers that come from Pennsylvania, from Maryland, from DC, Virginia, such a huge part of what Penn State has done over the years. And really, you're starting over, and you're starting over with the guy that has been there for the last 12 years, just south of that, in Blacksburg. So I think that's a big challenge for them. So I think they're going to get rolling at some point. It's going to be one of those things where I think, maybe pick off a couple in the spring. The schedule, the visit schedule.
How important is the spring for that? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm curious of, like, to get rolling. They've had really interrupted recruiting spurts after the transfer portal. And now they're going to be starting a little bit later in spring, but at some point to kind of like really have the opportunity to get guys into the building, get guys onto campus and meet the staff. And I understand, like, they're doing the electronic communication, but that face-to-face stuff, the in-person, seeing the facilities, all those things, feels like it's very important in the recruiting pitch for Penn State of a cultural fit. So, like, is this the opportunity for them to actually get that rolling now that spring practice is going to be starting in a couple weeks?
Two very different thoughts on this. First off, you think back to when they were hired, December, dead period. Opens up into January. You have to retain your roster. You have to build your roster through the transfer portal. And then the back half of January, you're able to host junior days. They hosted about 15 guys per junior day. I think that's a bit light, personally, just based on what we've seen from the past. They used to be 40 guys, and not all 40 guys were prospects, but you have those opportunities where a guy comes to, how many times do we see a guy come to a junior day in February without an offer? And then all of a sudden blows up in the spring or the summer or something like that. And you have that relationship, that experience to fall back on. This guy's been to campus. So I do question the limited number of guys that they brought in. Was that because of mindset? Was that because of relationships? I think that's probably both in that case. And I think that you would probably like to see that expanded. And then you hit the February dead period, which is not great for all new coaches, really, because you're trying to build on that momentum, ride with it as long as you can, and get guys on campus. I also broke down how many commits each new Power 4 head coach has so far since they've been hired. The most is 2. So Penn State's not a complete outlier in terms of being 0. I don't have those numbers right in front of me, but it's a fascinating look, because you think you're really behind when really you're just playing the same game that Michigan's playing right now. You're playing the same game that the Auburn and Florida are, I think, on the 2 list. So like that's where you're at with all those. Ideally, you want to go back to October and not lose the 4 commits you had, but
right,
we're well past that. And that's another thing to deal with if you're Penn State. You look at how toxic that time period was, really, and how everything seemed to go wrong until it went right and you hired Matt Campbell. But you still have a lot of that rust that you have to sort of buff off of there. That whether it's legitimate or not is another conversation. But you're looking at a situation where Penn State was down for a while and sort of just like they were just hanging on the line, right? They're a fish that's just, just kind of flopping around a little bit, and there's no way to get to the right opportunity until December when you hire Matt Campbell. And that's going to linger for a little bit, I think. And that's going to be a challenge that this staff has to overcome, especially when Virginia Tech, it keeps going back to this. Virginia Tech was able to get in, start recruiting, rekindle the relationships that they had with the guys that were previously on the board, because it's not about James Franklin targeting Penn State targets. It's about James Franklin and other schools being in the same general area, the same general vicinity as Penn State, and things are going to naturally overlap. It's just the way it is. Back to my last point. February dead period comes, not great. March comes, and you're looking at Penn State's schedule. Spring break is next week, so you don't want to host guys on spring break, but they're bringing in Sean Curry this week, and that's it, really, in terms of visitors for 2027 that have offers and things of that nature. 2027 tight end from New Jersey, and that's it. And it's not different than what the last staff did, but when you have these giant lapses, when you have these long gaps in the calendar, how do you combat that? And Penn State has chosen to push things back to the back of March and the beginning of April with their spring practice, which is fine. But there wasn't a ton of movement, as much movement as I thought there would be before spring break. Going back years, this is when, let's see, Brock Bowers visited. So he had spring break early in, he was from Napa Valley in California. Still one of the funnier things that I can think of in terms of producing talent. But you were able to slip in a few guys before spring break, and then sort of play off of that after the pro day, after all that stuff started with spring practice. So, excuse me, I'm running out of wind here. So yeah, I think there's some naturally large gaps here, and I don't think that's the best thing. And I think that it's something they're going to have to overcome. Now, when you get into spring, it makes sense. That's when you start rolling. That's when you get a couple of those guys you think might be on the cusp getting into it, because you have to build that from spring visits to spring evaluation period to official visits. And here's where the second branch of that two answers comes in. A lot of this stuff doesn't matter until official visits anymore, because they've seen the prior classes come through and think, okay, the official visits, that's when I can negotiate. That's when I can get what I need to get for me, my family, whatever it may be. And a lot of these guys are thinking, I'm in a position, not all of them are, I'm in a position to wait it out. And I think that that's where you're finding it right now. And that's what we're looking on on a national scope in terms of what is happening for every school right now. There are I'm going to, whenever you talk next, I'm going to go back and look and see how many commitments there were in February. Couldn't have been more than a couple of dozen. So I'm fascinated to see which direction this is going to go. So I would say there's plenty of questions that I have in terms of how much they're going to swing things quickly. But also I think that they're going to get there eventually. Somebody said in the chat here, we have to be patient with this. You do, but I can't tell you that because it sounds like spin. Right. And it's also,
but it's the natural. So it is the natural ramp up from the idea that these are new coaches in a new position. So a lot of the relationships and the movement we've seen in the class so far have come from Minnesota, from Nebraska, from the Midwest. Like, there's more competition right now with the Nebraska Cornhuskers than there are with Michigan, Ohio State, South Carolina, Clemson, all of the teams, Notre Dame, all the teams that we've come to understand as Penn State's recruiting rivals in the region. And so it both feels like there's more of a national approach to this team, and also not, because of the fact that, like, these are some far-flung places, and the areas that are in their region right now, as you mentioned, as we've talked about, like, from a relationship standpoint, there is this aspect of it will take time just to get to know people. Like, that is the thing. You can take a shortcut with money to get to know people if you want to get commitments and you want to, like, just kind of stir the pot. But when it comes to those lasting, durable commitments and getting guys to commit to Penn State for more than just money, which is going to be a problem down the road if they're there for just money, then you're going to take time to get all those things together. But you say something at the very end of that I think is interesting, and we saw the evidence in the last 2 years with James Franklin about this particular aspect of it. The relationship can be great, but if the compensation is not organized, and organization of the presentation is also important from the people I've talked to about like how Penn State was going about NIL, that if it's more organized and it's actually competitive, then you might have a better opportunity of landing the guys that you're trying to target at that official visit window, because you can have all the relationship in the world. If you don't close the deal, you don't close the deal. Did I give you enough time to look up that information?
I'm looking at the information. I'm counting right now, which is not a strong suit of me. I'm a words guy, not a numbers guy. But it comes down to about 1 per day.
Okay.
You know, I don't even know if that's a Power 4 number. But it's very different in terms of what you're able to do in February. And I think we had the same conversation last year, so it's not different than that. But the expectations versus the norm is I think it's pretty different in this sense. So I'm looking down through here, and you know, you got some USC and Miami and Tennessee and Texas, and that's pretty much it. Oregon got a running back in the middle of February. So you've got some comparable, or what you'd like to be comparable programs there getting commitments, but it's not the flood that we've seen in different spots. And going back to the original piece that I wrote on Friday is April has been good to this staff, and specifically for quarterbacks. I think in the 6 classes that we went over, 4 or 5 had quarterbacks that committed in April, including Rocco Beck. Mm-hmm. So Alex Mansky was an outlier. He committed in February. So he was an early guy, as an in-state guy. So you've got a lot of promise in that regard for April. I'm not saying it's going to lead to a ton of commitments for Penn State, but that's when they kind of ramp their work up is in April, and we'll see if that remains the same at Penn State. Very well could not. Like, very well could have written 3,000 words and just been like, well, you know, it's a different school, it's a different logo, it's a different opportunity for them to recruit. Yeah, it could be. I hope not, because I put a lot of effort into it. But no, I think that's worth reading, number one, and reading the entire way through, and then discussing in terms of what the expectations are probably going to be for this class, because I think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be top 10, maybe top 15. I think it's going to be a top 20 class eventually. But you're going to get to it in a different. You're going to take some different directions to get there.
Mini preview of what's coming up next. I'm also excited to see what they do in quarterback recruiting, because that has been a hallmark of the staff of producing quarterbacks, even if they are finding the right guy who actually has the intangible skills to go along with enough tangible skills. Now can they get the guys that have the overt tangible skills and find the guys that have what they think makes a great quarterback? Because that is something that we've seen routinely with this particular staff. And then the last thing before we get to Alan is Bizzle has a question. He says, when you say negotiate, does every player have an agent? 5 stars probably do, but are 2 and 3 stars getting agents in the recruiting process? How does that work, Fitz?
Everybody has an agent, whether that's a legitimate agent, whether that's a family member, whether that's something else. Everyone has somebody that is helping them out. It helps the process when you have legitimate agents. It does not help the process when you do not. And I think that you're going to see, and we've seen it. I mean, in the last class, you could probably pick out a dozen guys that were, affiliated with agents, throw the hand quotes up there, and got left in the dark because, number one, coaches want to deal with legitimate enterprises. They want to deal with people that they know. They want to deal with people that they think have the best interest of the kid in mind. And I think when you saw, and flatly, when you saw Penn State's new staff come in, a bunch of guys that had those kinds of agents that were on the roster are no longer here. And I think that that's a statement. Now, sometimes the talent is going to shine through. What you'll see a lot of these times is, Jerry Maguire's situation where you have your guy, and then all of a sudden you get too good or you get too high profile, and you have to turn to a legitimate agent. And that's a better thing for the player, I think. But yeah, it's just all over the board. There's no regulation on this. And it's tough to sort of determine or tell a kid, really. That's the tough part, to tell a kid.
Especially because you're on the other side of the table. Like, the advice is not going to come through as genuine from somebody who's on the other side of the negotiation.
Well, I mean, you can't look at a kid in negotiation and say, hey, this guy is screwing you over. Like this guy is doing things clearly for himself or for, or for his company or for his, thinking about his other clients, which is what you do when you're an agent. But at the same time, you usually do that in better faith than some approaches have been taken. So yes, everybody's got some sort of it, some sort of representation. I mean, the best ones are the ones that you look at. I talked about Mason Bandauer a little bit ago. That guy jumped in on board, very few questions asked. Cooper Cousins a couple of years ago would have been that guy. You've got opportunities to find guys that are just here for I don't want to say the love of it, the love of dear old state or whatever we want to delude ourselves into thinking, but you're here for, let's just get this done and get on with it. And those guys end up being pretty successful. I'm not going to lie. Like I've got theories here in terms of, and this is way off of our target here, in terms of the most successful guys are the ones that you probably don't hear from all that much. You think back to the draft picks that Penn State's had. Tyler Warren didn't have Twitter, you find guys that are doing things for the right reasons. You find guys that love football, and you find guys that love being a part of something bigger than they are. And those guys will thrive. It's not the guys that are going to be out there on Twitter, retweeting, like searching their names on Twitter, retweeting everything that has been tweeted about them, about how great they are. Those guys end up in the portal, a lot of them. And a lot of them end up not playing college football beyond a couple of years because they're looking for something that is kind of a false prophet there. They're looking for, they're looking to feel good. It doesn't work like that. So I think that you can find ways to be successful without being the most famous, the most clout. And I think that makes sense. And I don't have numbers to back that up, but there's enough analytical data out there that would suggest that those guys that seek that stuff out don't end up panning out because of psychological, social reasons as well.
Yeah, well, so this is mostly a joke, but the one area would be receiver, and you need to find some positively charged narcissists, some people who have those earmarkers, but also love football and are trying to do it for the right reasons and are just like wired that way. But that feels like trying to find a chocolate coin in a sea of rocks or something. I don't know. That was terrible. I was going with fake treasure.
Okay.
Good transition of me stumbling over my words is to people who are going to have a great conversation here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel on the BWI Live Recruiting Edition. Alan Trieu, national reporter here for Rivals, joined us on March 1st. Once again, just as a reminder before we get into that, that's the reason he and Alan Huffman coming in, and it's going to be 50% off right now through not much longer. I think maybe next week, early next week, we're turning this one off. So 50% off for the first week that they're here. Subscribe to the BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, and you can get access to our content and their content for half off. And we hope that you enjoyed this conversation between Fitz and between Alan.
I was recruiting a new face to some, a familiar face to me, one of my favorites of all time, joining the team this week with Rivals at On3, Alan Trieu, regional recruiting analyst, national recruiting analyst, I guess now. Alan and I worked together at 24/7 Sports for years. Previously, he was at Scout. He's one of the best to ever do it, and we're pretty excited to have him on hand, especially excited because he's got some connections we're going to talk about a little bit very, very, very shortly. Alan, welcome to the team. So happy to see your face, man.
Yeah, I see your face on Instagram still from time to time, but not in this capacity. So it's nice to be reunited in a professional capacity.
Well, that's why we do it, right? I think when I left, when we were talking about me leaving, you were like, well, never say never. We might work together again. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, here we are, and we're pumped to have you because, like I said, you're among the best. And this is a spot in the Midwest that we as a network definitely we had a hole there and we needed some work there. But at the same time, we at the Penn State site, and those that are following at Blue White Illustrated, those that are following on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube page, I think you're going to get pretty familiar with Alan because the Midwest is a hot button issue for the Matt Campbell staff at Penn State. I guess first, getting into it, can you go through your history with Matt Campbell? I know you've been covering since he was, back in the MAC. So what have you seen from Matt Campbell over the last decade or so that makes you think that it's a fit for Penn State?
Yeah. So, first, I think the previous Penn State staff always came over a little bit. We had we talked to each other here and there, mostly on Michigan kids, because I think when Tim Banks was around, they got into Detroit quite a bit, and Terry Smith had some connections there, but not like this is going to be. And they're going to come past Detroit over into Illinois, over into Wisconsin. You got kids from Minnesota that are being recruited by Penn State, the Dakotas. So that's very exciting. When I was just starting out, I went down to a Toledo football camp. Tim Beckman was the head coach at the time. And it's really nuts to think about now, because on that Toledo staff that day, I met Coach Campbell, who was coaching offensive line. Alex Golish, now the head coach at Auburn, was on that staff. Steve Klinkscale, now with the Chargers. Lou Ianni, now with the Broncos. And I'm probably forgetting a bunch, but all of those coaches under Coach Beckman have now become major coaches in the NFL or college. And as Coach Campbell, even at that time, Toledo focused a lot of their offensive line recruiting in Ohio. They got over into Illinois at that point. And when he took over as head coach at Toledo, that continued to be the philosophy. Got over into the East Coast some too. And then at Iowa State, heavily in Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, even over into Michigan, and Ohio continued to be a very fruitful place for them. When you look at their history of recruiting guys like Kareem Hunt, David Montgomery, a lot of the hits at Toledo and Iowa State were kids from the Midwest.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of those things that the Penn State fans are going to continue to have to get used to, is that, you're so used to this 6-hour recruiting radius. You're used to, recruiting Virginia, New Jersey, and all these hotbeds around here. But like, you go with what you know, right? You look at how Penn State has approached the class of 2027, 0 commits right now, but a ton of interest. And a lot of that interest really, it's probably about a 50-50 split right now in terms of if you were going to pick who would jump on board first. Like the Midwest is certainly, probably at the top of the list. So I'm very intrigued to see this 2027 class play out. How do you think they left Iowa State from a relationship standpoint, from here's what we're going to be able to build on in the Midwest at Penn State, just based on how they were able to establish those relationships?
In terms of the relationships in the high schools in the Midwest and the other kind of influencers like trainers, 7-on-7 coaches, that kind of thing in the Midwest, I think the relationships are really, really strong. And I think that those relationships happen when you don't go into a region or even an individual high school and just skim the top. They wanted to get to know everybody. They took some sleepers at Iowa State. They showed themselves a lot. They were there at camps. They were there at satellite events. They did a really, really good job of canvassing the region and building those relationships and really leaving no stone unturned in terms of their evaluation. And when you see how many guys they're now recruiting at Penn State who are big time guys, where the first offer for that kid or the first major offer was Iowa State, that's proof of that. Even the other schools kind of lamented, like, these guys are always first on guys in the region. And so when you do that, I think you build up a lot of goodwill.
How does the response change for a kid who gets his first offer from Iowa State, knowing the hierarchy of college football and how everything works with Big 10, Big 12, whatever? How does that change now that they're at Penn State? If I don't know if Penn State's going to be the first offer for these guys or not, but those feelings melted away at times with Iowa State. You think Jet Tamala last year, Alabama comes in, and they've been harvested a few times for some big time prospects. Milan Paris, there are several examples of, getting to a certain point and then kind of falling off. Is that something that changes at Penn State with these guys, you think?
I do think so. So first of all, I think that when you have been as successful as they were at Iowa State in recruiting and development, the challenge when you get to a place like Penn State is, how do we adapt this over here? How do we take what made us great over there and sort of amend and add to it here without maybe losing some of that in translation? So like you said, maybe they're not going to be first as much as they were at Iowa State. Maybe you don't have to do that quite as much at Iowa State, but you don't want to lose some of that. I think what translates always, though, is the personalities and the relationship building, and you still have that. But I do think that they are going to be less prone to be poached than they did at Iowa State. They always knew that that was going to be a possibility, and the examples that you gave and many others show that. And schools were really paying attention to what they did, who they offered, who they were going after. I think that's still going to happen at Penn State, but I think they're going to have a little more behind them to be able to keep those guys in the fold. So I think you still want to be early. You still want to establish those relationships. You want to get a lot of kids on campus, which they do. I thought they did a fantastic job at Iowa State of getting guys up for game days. Even kids now that the new Iowa State staff is recruiting, a lot of those kids have already touched the soil there in Ames. You keep doing that at Penn State, and with the knowledge that you're going to be able to hold on to these guys perhaps a little bit easier than you did at Iowa State.
What is the challenge there with the Midwest kids looking to get out and, I just think it's different out there because of the space, because of the miles between these different schools. What is different for them as they approach, visiting Penn State? We saw Cooper Terwilliger, Case Alexander, guys like that have connections to those programs. We're able to make it in February, but it's not a place where you can go from Kansas or Iowa or something like that and visit every other weekend or something. How do you think Penn State handles those guys, when the approach has always been 6-hour radius and in?
Well, the first thing I think, you mentioned having to go where so they did. That's how you start, right? At the beginning, when you first take over, you're drinking from the fire hose. You don't have a chance to start to learn your immediate region. We see that at a couple of the schools that have coaching changes. I mean, I'm here in Michigan. It's the same thing where the staff at Michigan is going to go recruit Utah and those areas they know first. And then they're going to work their way back here and sort of establish themselves regionally and inside the state. I think that's going to happen at Penn State. That's part of the challenge is learning the East Coast. I don't think that the regions that you mentioned off the bat, the DMV, like those are going to be important recruiting areas. But at least in the start of the 2027 class, you had to go back out to the areas, especially with the kids you have established relationships with, like a Cooper Terwilliger. I think that is the challenge, though. When you have those established relationships, those kids will come. The next class, when it comes around, if you don't have that established relationship, will it be as easy to get a kid from North or South Dakota or from Omaha to come out to Happy Valley and visit? I think it's possible, but I think by that time, Penn State will have moved their recruiting a little bit more towards the east without losing some of those connections that they built at Iowa State.
I agree. I think there's a lot of natural attrition in terms of, you just kind of fade out eventually. And that's fine. I mean, you got to grow into, as we mentioned on our site before, the DMV is going to be a challenge because there's no ace there. Jersey, they hired a couple of guys. It's going to be a process to continue to get in there. And then, the old staff is 6 hours down the road in Blacksburg. So there's a lot that can work against that. So I agree. Lean on what you know. Who are some of the guys in the Midwest that, have really jumped out to you? And, we talked about a couple of names so far, but who are a couple of guys in the Midwest that, make more sense than they typically would, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, off the bat, the couple predictions that I've made since coming over, Will Slagle, I mean, without this staff leaving, he's a Cyclone and he's done. And that's not a kid that traditionally, I think Penn State recruits coming over into Iowa, but I think he's going to end up in the class. I know he's got some other visits that he's going to take this spring. My sense there is this is his second time through the recruiting process and doesn't want to make another fast decision, wants to get a chance to get to see some of the coaches that were recruiting him in new places. But everyone basically knows Penn State's the team that they have to beat. Cooper Terwilliger, we just talked about him. I mean, I think that's gone from Nebraska feeling like they were the top school there or the school to beat to Penn State now being the one. So I have a prediction in for him. Blake Benton's an interesting one. I was close to putting in a prediction for him. He has so many visits that he's taking, but linebacker from up there in Minnesota. Again, if this staff isn't here, I don't think Blake Benton probably is looking at Penn State or taking some visits. His dad said after he takes his spring visits, he's going to set his full schedule of official visits. The fact that Penn State was set prior to all of that tells me that's the one he wanted to lock in, and then he's going to figure out the rest of them later. So I think Penn State's in good position for him going into those visits.
Yeah, Benton's interesting because he's very, very active. And I know he said Penn State is at the top of the list, but when you take that many visits, when you are that active on the scene, it's tougher to just throw in a prediction, like an end game prediction, rather than a, where's he leaning right now prediction. So I agree with you on all of those guys. Looking at the Penn State staff, who really jumps out to you as active recruiters, as their guys that are going to be leaned upon as they try to plow new ground in this region, and really who has jumped out to you over the last couple of years as somebody that's got a really good eye for what they're looking at?
Yeah. So a couple of things there. First, you were talking about not really having an ace in that DMV East Coast area. I think the good thing is the more that I've done this, the more that I've learned that it's nice to have some prior connections, but it's not 100% necessary. I said the same thing with the new staffs at Michigan and Michigan State. If you're a good recruiter, you're gonna quickly build those connections, and sometimes it's actually good to start with a blank state where the high school coaches in the region, with them, you can kind of erase the past and come in and say, hey, we're starting fresh. Maybe you saw it a little bit at the end of last cycle with a guy like Samson Gash that Penn State was able to get in on, even though the previous staff hadn't recruited him. You get to restart things. And I think that's what's going to happen up that way. So, I think on the offensive side of the ball, Ryan Clanton stands out right away. I even wrote, today about some of the guys that on the team that were going to leave via the portal and stayed largely because of him and his development history. He's a big one. Taylor Mouser, those guys have really had a great eye for talent at their other stops. On the defensive side of the ball, Deion Broomfield, I think, is a rising star in the profession. Tyson Veit does a fantastic job. He was with that staff at Iowa State, went over to Cincinnati and did a really, really good job in Cincinnati, Ohio guy. So he's going to help them be able to recruit there and towards the East Coast. So I think those are some of the ones that I have the most familiarity with that I think are going to do a really good job.
Can you put into words how much evaluating means to the staff? Because they are like stick to their guns, unlike many things that I've seen throughout college football, not even just this last Penn State staff, but they seem to know what they're looking for, sort of engage that and sort of hone in on what can make them, what can fit what they're looking for. So just what's your take on their evaluation skills, their evaluation process, and really why they're not, I haven't seen them, I don't want to say bullied into taking guys or offering guys that they shouldn't, or maybe showing excess interest. What do you think their entire approach is there?
Well, I think they knew that was going to have to be their bread and butter when they got to Iowa State. The situation that they took over there, they weren't going to be able to go and necessarily win recruiting battles. So you had to hit on some guys that other schools were going to miss. And then the more that they did it, the more that you find Will McDonald right under Wisconsin's nose and he becomes a first-round pick, the more that you find Breece Hall and Brock Purdy and those guys, then I think it built a lot of confidence in them that, like, yeah, we're going to believe what we see. And then we're not only going to believe what we see, but we're going to trust that we're going to be able to develop those guys, which they've done. When schools throw out a lot of offers and early offers, like Iowa State was doing at first, the tendency for other fan bases and for other coaching staffs is to go, they're just spraying them out there. But the amount of guys that were hit on early when they did that was incredible. I mean, Iowa State did very, very little of having to turn around and not honor those offers. When they offered a guy, even when it was early, a lot of the time it stuck. That kid either ended up at Iowa State or he ended up at a major school. There was not a lot of walking back of offers. And that just shows you how good the hit rate was when they offered a player really well ahead of time in most of those cases. These guys are great examples. Blake Benton, great example. Case Alexander, guys like that they were very, very early on at Iowa State. They don't have to walk those back a lot of the time.
Are there any positions that sort of jump out to you for these guys in terms of what they've been able to develop? I know when Campbell was hired, I talked to Steve, and he kind of hammered home the quarterback aspect of scouting those guys early, taking those guys early, and they didn't always get them, but they were kind of well ahead of the curve in terms of evaluation. Are there any positions with this staff that you think that they are better than most?
Yeah, I mean, I think offensive line, I mentioned Ryan Clanton, that success goes back to when he was at Northern Iowa, where pulled a lot of rabbits out of the hat there. Like I said about, taking guys from under people's noses. They did a lot of that in his previous stops. And Coach Campbell's an O-line guy himself. So I think you have the double evaluation there. Tight end is a position that's obviously strong tradition at Penn State, but at Iowa State, I mean, they hit on a lot of guys there that when you look at their they built themselves into a school that has really strong recent tight end history. And not a lot of those guys were like high-end 4-star type recruits. Those were a lot of evaluation wins that they had there. And then wide receiver. I mean, you look at the amount of, I almost couldn't believe how many wide receivers they hit on, especially in the last couple cycles you have guys like Jay Higgins and Jalen Noel and guys like that getting drafted. That was not a position that prior to them arriving at Iowa State that you saw a lot of Cyclone receivers getting drafted, and they came in right away with Hakeem Butler and carried it right out into the last couple classes with Higgins and Noel.
Interesting. Anybody in the Midwest that really jumps out at you is like, hey, this is a guy that Penn State likes. This is a guy that Penn State kind of fits. Maybe might be on the radar. I mean, we saw a rankings update last week where some of those guys went way up. But is there anybody that really jumps at you as a Penn State fit out there and sort of can make that transition to the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, whatever it may be?
Yeah, you're talking in terms of like guys that they've offered, other than the guys that have been predicted.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the one of the interesting guys that I mentioned in the article is Davis Seaman, who's an Ohio guy, Columbus guy, has an Ohio State offer. So you think right away he's just going to go to Ohio State. But Iowa State was the first offer for him. So he's going to take an official to Penn State. And I think a lot of people thought that one was a done deal for the Buckeyes, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case yet. I would still lean towards Ohio State, but Penn State's really making that a battle. Daryl Madison is a really interesting one out of Chicago. I know the staff really likes him. I think when you turn on the film, he's a potentially special player. Just hasn't got out much on the national scene yet, so I'm not sure how many schools really know about him. But he's interesting. Roman Combs is the other one I mentioned in the article. That's the type of athlete that this staff had a lot of success with at Iowa State. He's a 6'5" basketball player. He's got some lower level basketball offers. Plays corner for his high school, but at 6'5", I mean, they can convert him into a lot of different things. And I thought they did a really, really good job of figuring out where some of those positionless type athletes were. There's some really good players that they haven't offered yet in the state of Iowa. I would look at a guy like Will Clausen, who was, didn't have a ton of Power 4 interest coming up. Minnesota just offered him a few weeks ago. That's a name to look out for because I think they'll go back to some of those connections in the state of Iowa. There always seems to be kids in that state that Iowa and Iowa State dig out during the summer evaluation months, and then even into their senior year. Sometimes those schools will just pop a guy late, and I think Penn State's going to keep looking over into that area as well.
What do you think they have to learn taking that leap from Iowa State to Penn State? And you mentioned I don't know about conceding, but like you mentioned having to be flexible with a 6'5", 230 athlete. I know they had and the name escapes me right now, but they had a quarterback committed a couple of years ago. They wanted to make a tight end. He ended up at Wyoming. I think he's an Incarnate Word now. Like how much of that development and sort of, I don't want to say kicking the can down the road, but how much of that kind of projection did they do? And do you think they'll have to do at Penn State now that they're in a kind of a more fruitful area?
Yeah, they did a good amount of it at Iowa State. I think you have the luxury of doing it less at Penn State, but at the same time, that tends to work out, and I see it work out for schools like Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin in the Big Ten, who I think those schools, traditionally speaking, have done a really good job of finding those same kind of guys. So I think you want to blend things. I don't think that in recruiting, you can just have one approach of we're just going to recruit the top of the board, or we're only going to recruit sleepers and try to find diamonds in the rough. I think when you're at a place like Penn State and you have a staff that's built like this one, you have to do a little of both. If there's a Will McDonald that comes around again, you want to take that guy. They did it at the end of last year's class with Elijah Reeder. So I think they're going to continue to do that. But I think now you're at a place where you can go recruit Malachi Goodman too. So I think that's the challenge for them, is finding the right sort of blend of at what percentage do we recruit the blue chips and at what percentage do we trust our evaluations? I think at Penn State, you slide it more towards recruiting the blue chips, but that's going to be the challenge, is getting in with the top end kids on the East Coast while still keeping your eyes open for the diamonds in the rough.
Can you kind of summarize the challenge that they had from a money standpoint? Obviously, Penn State is not at the top of the list, but probably a little bit more in the bankroll there for NIL. How do you think that changes things for Matt Campbell at Penn State? And how much can you blend the old versus the new when it comes to this entire recruiting game?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge because you have more of a budget than you had to work with at Iowa State. I know for a fact that Jet Tamala, I think if they could have just gotten the money up a little bit more, it wasn't, he wanted to stay at Iowa State for a time period, and the NIL was a big part of that. I think when you look at Penn State now, they're going to have more to work with than they did at Iowa State, but you're also recruiting against schools who have bigger budgets. So that to me is the challenge, is, yeah, we have this to work with now, but the other schools that come up here and recruit the best of the best in that East Coast region, they're going to be able to throw out some serious NIL. So I think that's where you have to decide where you're going to allocate those funds, and then you trust your evaluations on the rest of that crew. And so I think for the fan base, you're going to have to be patient and understand that they may not just walk in and start winning 5-star and high 4-star battles out there, although I think they're going to give it a good effort. But this is a staff that every message board says trust their staff, right? This group has earned the right to do that. Every fan base says that, and sometimes their coaching staffs don't have the cachet that this one does. When you look at their hit rate, if they offer a guy who doesn't have a ton of offers and may not be ranked, may not even be in a database from time to time, in the past, typically that's worked out.
We're in the first week of March, and I know there's some already off the train, so which is just incredible to me. Just like you're looking at a staff that's proven it, and you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt to come in and evaluate. And you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt to develop, and it's 3 months in, and here we are. 4 months in, and here we are. So that's always fun, right?
Listen, they're not alone though. Like I said, I'm in a state at Michigan and Michigan State where the people here are the same. It's like, how come in-state kids aren't just falling out of the sky for either of the staffs? And knowing a lot of these staffs that have switched places, it wasn't until this recent dead period where a lot of them could even unpack themselves, right? They were all in suitcases and temporary housing until about now. So my message to all those fan bases with new coaching staffs is let them get settled in, let them build some relationships, and really even let them get through, I think, one full cycle before you can really say much about how recruiting goes in the spring. There's a lot, especially with the way the calendar is now, you jump right in and you're thrown into portal season, and also let's save our roster first of all, and then you get a chance to catch your breath and maybe try to make some of the connections with these 27s.
Yeah, I think it's a natural casualty here with the February dead period, because you're looking at jumping into saving your roster, number one, building your roster in the portal, and then all of a sudden, 2 junior days for most places, maybe 3 if you're lucky, and then the February dead period hits. I did something on the site the other day about how many commitments have actually been picked up since most coaching changes in Power 4 have happened, and I think the most is 2. So it's a pretty remarkable case study in patience, number one, and number two, just kind of how this is all playing out, especially, with the money aspect coming into play, with official visits in summer being as important as they've ever been. How much growth we see from January to May or June is sort of curtailed. So that's been interesting. I guess my last question, you knew the prior Penn State staff pretty well. You know this staff pretty well. What are the differences that you're looking between the two staffs, and how does one, not saying one's better than the other or anything like that, but what differences do you expect from an approach standpoint, from an effectiveness standpoint, between James Franklin's staff and between Matt Campbell's staff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have 2 head coaches in James Franklin and Matt Campbell who take a very active approach in recruiting, but have fairly different personalities in how they approach that. Coach Franklin, I think both very personable, both very well spoken. But I think Coach Campbell has definitely a little bit more of this Midwest feel to him. I mean, he's a Midwest guy through and through, a little bit more understated. And I think that's how they're going to recruit also. That's the philosophy of we're going to trust our eyes and trust our evaluation. I think they're going to move to the point where it's closer to what the last staff did of, like I said, recruiting the national board, but you're going to get some exciting hits as well of some guys that, like I said, they're going to pull some kids that surprise you. Elijah Reeder is a good example from the end of last class where he's in Jersey. Nobody knows that guy. Iowa State finds him. We thought the film was fantastic once we finally sat down and were able to kind of settle it out and see what that kid was all about. You're going to get some of that. So I think that the philosophy is the same in that recruiting is the lifeblood. It's very important. When you talked earlier about, which assistants are strong recruiters, it's all of them. They're all expected to. And that was the case under Coach Franklin. Is everybody's got to pitch in, everybody's got to recruit. That's the same with this staff. And I think that comes from the head coach. And the head coach isn't just the closer. He's very involved throughout the process. So I think those are the similarities between the two. And one last thing I want to say too is I think now in college football, very important that you have more than one off-field person who's capable. And I think they've got several. I know Derek Hoodger has done a really, really great job at Iowa State, and he's going to bring that over to Penn State. But he's got several hands on deck with him that I think do a great job. And in today's college football, we just mentioned all the different things you have to do with the portal and retaining your roster and then still recruiting high school kids. I think they have a really, really strong off-field department.
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress, but it's a fun work in progress because you can kind of see it play out in front of you, which is not always what we're used to, especially after James Franklin being here for 12 years. I mean, it's just a different sort of gear to switch into, and I think it's been fun to see how they've sort of stuck to what they learned and cut their teeth at Iowa State, but also that broad horizon when they get to Penn State. So it's going to continue to be fascinating to watch. We're going to follow it here on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. And Alan Trieu is going to be a big part of it. Alan, again, psyched to have you back on the same team. Again, one of the best in the business. Go ahead and throw him a follow on Twitter because there's going to be a lot of Penn State stuff coming. So Alan, thank you very much for joining us.
Just want to echo what Fitz said there. Thanks to Alan for joining us. That'll do it for today's show. Make sure you check us out. Like we said, we're going to have some content for you coming up next week and this weekend as well. So we're not going anywhere. We're just not going to be doing a live show for the next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday during spring break. And then, of course, we're coming back all systems ahead for the lead up to spring football. We'll have spring football previews continuing next the week after next. And, of course, we're going to have everything that continues at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. There's no time off at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Articles every single day from Greg, Ryan, Sean, Fitz, and Greg and myself. We will talk to you later.